Good evening. Glad you're with us tonight, whoever you are, wherever you are. This week, we will pivot from the time of the Crusades from last week to a time that is really going to go to define the futures for perhaps two of the most significant nations of the Middle Ages, which were England and France. We will examine how from the start, when the Normans took over England in 1066, if you remember that, to the early 1300s, England and France are really locked in a very tense struggle over who's going to govern both of those nations. We're going to see that morph into what will become the outbreak of the 100 Years' War. Talk more about that. And we'll hear, of course, names and places of great fame and notoriety even. Names like Crécy and Poitiers, Agincourt, Orléans, and Joan of Arc with that, of course, and Castillo, the last battle of the war. And we will also see the absolutely explosive, to say the least, path of the Black Plague, and how it not only will afflict the two nations in combat, but also savage basically all of Europe in the process. But first, as always, some context. The name 100 Years' War is, believe it or not actually an accurate historical explanation of the events that took place. And that name is actually kind of a joke among historians. First of all, the 100 Years' War was not 100 years. It took longer than that. It took over 116 years. Posterity just slapped the term on it for the sake of clarity, basically. Second, it was not just one continuous war for 116 years. Rather, it was a series of conflicts spread out over that entire period, with some periods of inactivity, or at least less activity, and then some hot spots as well, obviously. Historians of the time actually break it into three separate wars under the overall umbrella term, and those being the Edwardian War from 1337 to 1360, the Caroline War from 1369 to 1389, and the Lancastrian War from 1415 to 1453, with truces in effect in between each of those periods. So three different periods of almost nonstop war between 1337 and 1453. The two factions fighting were the houses of Plantagenet and Lancaster, who ruled the Kingdom of England, and the House of Valois, who ruled the Kingdom of France. 5 generations of kings between these two rivals fought over who would control the Kingdom of France. But as I said, it really does all start with the Norman Conquest in 1066, when the Normans from northern France, if you remember, go across the English Channel and invade England and defeat the English monarchs and the nobility, and then set about claiming all of their lands and replacing the English nobility with their own Norman nobility. And this actually ends up setting up a weird relationship between these now Norman rulers of England and then the Kingdom of France, because due to both the pre-existing political agreements between the Normans and the French before the Normans invaded England, and the Norman practice of awarding the royalty and nobility lands and titles in France as well as in England. So because of that, for instance, the King of England during this time is technically a vassal of the King of France. During this time, the King of England is also the Duke of Aquitaine, which is much of western France, and which was itself a sworn vassal state of the Kingdom of France. So the sovereign ruler of one nation is also the sworn servant of another sovereign ruler in another nation. But also as a result of this different system, the crown of England was held by a succession of nobles who already owned lands in France, which made them at the time some of the most powerful subjects of the French king, because they could now draw on the economic power they had in England, as well as in France, to enforce their interests in mainland France. So to the kings of France, this is a tremendously dangerous threat to their royal authority. And so as a result, they would constantly try to undermine the rule of England and France, while the English monarchs at the same time would be struggling to protect and expand their lands. So if you can look at this map, the lands in blue in the east of the map were lands that were basically always French, lands that had been French since before the 1200s even. The lands in purple in the middle and to the northwest and even to the south used to be held by the Norman monarchs and the nobility of England, but were gradually taken away, mostly through conflict, by the French up till about 1330. So all that purple land was at some point English and was eventually taken by the French. And the lands that are in pink are England, of course, in the north, and then the last English territorial possession in France, Gascony, in the south. And so you have this issue with English land claims in France, and especially with this weird dual nature of the throne of England being both sovereign ruler and bound servant to the French king. And on top of this, for some time, well before the 14th century begins, France is, and will continue to be for some time, a sworn ally of Scotland. At this time, Scotland is still an independent kingdom and nation, and the English have long desired to go in and rout the Scots and take over Scotland. But the fact that the French had sworn their allegiance and their military support, more importantly, to the Scots means that at this point it's almost impossible for the English to do anything about Scotland during this time. So there are a lot of different things that heap up over this time and give us context for what begins to happen next. At the end of April 1337, King Philip IV of France was invited by the English to meet the delegation from England, the diplomatic delegation, at the royal court, but he refused. And in fact, he actually issues a call to arms, proclaims it throughout France, starting on April 30th of 1337. Then in May, Philip meets with his council in Paris. It was agreed then that Aquitaine, which was still owned by England, but had been effectively reduced to the area of Gascony that we mentioned, should be taken back into the French king's hands on the grounds that England's King Edward III was in breach of his obligations as vassal, because he had sheltered Philip's mortal enemy and a French criminal, Robert d'Artois. Edward responds to this confiscation of Aquitaine by challenging Philip's right to the French throne. Not long before this, in 1328, the guy who was at the time the King of France, Charles IV, had died without any sons or any male siblings. And he had explicitly said on his deathbed that at which time, by the way, he has a daughter and a pregnant wife, that if the unborn child that his pregnant wife is carrying is a boy, he will become king. And that would make sense for the time, primogeniture. If it was born a girl, the French nobility would have the right to choose the next king. And so the child is born a girl, which leaves the choice to the nobility. Charles' closest male blood relative, to whom normally it would have been passed to, the throne that is, was his nephew Edward, who also happens to be King of England at the time. And so when Charles dies, Edward makes a claim for the French throne. And this claim was considered invalid by the French nobility because Charles had claimed it through the right of his mother, Isabella, who was Charles IV's sister and the daughter of the last French king, Philip IV. And she had claimed the throne for her son Edward. But the French decided that Isabella could not transmit a right that she did not have. And so they wanted a native Frenchman to receive the crown rather than Edward. So they pass the throne to Charles's cousin on his father's side, Philip, the Count of Valois. Edward protests, but he ultimately submits to the decision. But he never gives up on the idea of taking the French throne. And so after this has happened, when Philip in 1337 sends out the call to arms in France, Edward starts planning to claim the throne again. And this time it kind of works, actually. In 1340, Edward officially resubmitted and restated his claim to the French throne, and several significant cities in what's now Belgium, but was then held by France, cities with which England, in particular, had very strong trade relationships with, these cities declared Edward to be king. The French respond to this by trying to use their navy to disrupt these trade links, and they try to start raiding English ports, and they actually have some success with that. Edward, though, in response to this, immediately marshals both his army and his navy and sails for France on June 22nd of 1340. And he was immediately successful, almost completely destroying the French navy at the Battle of what's called Sluys. And the English navy dominated the English Channel for several years to come. And while this advantage was mostly used to repel any attempts at French invasion, there wasn't really any more face-to-face conflict for a few years. You next see them start fighting, or at least sort of Cold War fighting, during a smaller conflict over the region of Brittany, which is in northwest France, but at the time was its own independent state. And as I said, they basically fought a Cold War supporting either side of the battle for the next 5 years. Then in 1346, Edward invades Normandy, and he begins to sweep across northern France. When Philip and his army marched northward to stop the English army, the two forces meet at the town of Crécy, at the Battle of Crécy, on August 26th of 1346. And there the French are absolutely routed, due both to the success of the English archers, but then also by Philip's poor decision to attack preemptively before the army was ready to do so. And as a double bonus for the English, actually, when France gets into war, Scotland, to the aid of their French ally, invades northern England to support the French. And the Scots are defeated by the English remaining there. And so the threat of Scotland basically becomes a non-issue for some time to come. For the next 10 years or so, between repeated English victories and then the arrival of the Black Plague, France is basically on the ropes, for lack of a better way to put it. This culminates at the Battle of Poitiers in 1356, when the English destroyed the French army, and they captured the French king at the time, John II. And it's from here that France really appears to start unraveling at the seams, because the French nobility, not the English forces, not people hired by the English, the French nobility and their own hired mercenaries start to wreak havoc all across France, trying to loot and plunder and take control, basically. One account from the time put it this way: all went ill with the kingdom, and the state was undone. Thieves and robbers rose up everywhere in the land. The nobles despised and hated all others, and took no thought for usefulness and profit of lord and men. They subjected and despoiled the peasants and the men of the villages. In no way did they defend their country from its enemies. Rather did they trample it underfoot, robbing and pillaging the peasants' goods. So France is in shambles, the government's almost non-existent, it's all seemingly beyond repair, and this continues a while longer until 1360, when nothing less than a miracle saves the French from total national humiliation. On what becomes known as Black Monday, a freak lightning and hailstorm swells up over the English camp and devastates the English encampment, kills over 1,000 English soldiers with lightning and hail. More soldiers die on Black Monday than had in any of the previous battles that had happened before Black Monday. And so the English army after this is in pieces. Edward is forced to negotiate a truce. So on May 8th of 1360, the English and French agree to the terms of a truce. Edward renounces his claim to the throne of France and gives up all the land he had taken in the regions of Normandy, Touraine, Anjou, and Mayenne, in exchange for being given full control and greater area in the region of Aquitaine, which was still in English hands. And so the two countries stood at truce from 1360 until 1369, when in the aftermath of another Cold War, basically, fought between the two, supporting a civil war in Spain, we see the French begin to swing the tide in their favor. Between 1369, the French pushed the English almost completely out of France, defeating them numerous times both on land and at sea, and even raiding the English coast. everything was going great for the French, until their king Charles V dies in September of 1380. And all the momentum the French gain under Charles goes away. His successor is his son, Charles VI, who at the time is only 11 when he becomes king. So, to assist him in his rule, a group of his uncles decide to step in and help him. And all they manage to do is bungle everything up politically and economically in France. Between the continual destruction of French cities and lands since the start of the conflict, which are basically being used for the site of every battle fought, along with the spread of the plague and then subsequently the economy crashing, France is in turmoil, basically in anarchy for the next 8 years until Charles VI is old enough to have gotten a better grasp on politics and ruling, and he rights the ship. By this point, though, the people in both countries are tired of fighting in and especially paying for all of this this warfare. So another truce is negotiated in July of 1389. For the next 26 years, the English don't fight each other, but they do still fight, the English and the French. They fight against their neighbors, like Scotland and Castillo. They fight against pirate raids in port cities. They even fight internally, with the French fighting an internal conflict over control of the throne, which was suddenly up for grabs because Charles VI suddenly and inexplicably goes mad. This in particular actually becomes a problem because when Charles isn't ruling, other French nobles are functionally ruling the country. And they make a string of stupid decisions that go on to anger the English and start up another period of war between the two in 1415. In August, the English king, now Henry V by this point, invades northern France, and the French went north to meet them. And in a similar fashion to how the Battle of Crécy went in 1346, the English inflict another catastrophic defeat on the French at the Battle of Agincourt on October 25th in 1415. And it's hard to overstate just how much of a body blow this battle was to the French, not only because most of the French army was killed, but also because 40% of the French nobility fought and died in the Battle of Agincourt. The English were so complete in victory that they took more French prisoners than there were soldiers in the English army. And so now you have a problem because you can't adequately feed or guard all of them, so they basically just kill all of the prisoners. So you functionally almost killed every one of the French army at this point. And the English are, as you would imagine, once again quite successful for some time, close to 15 years after this. And then we see, beginning at the siege of the city of Poitiers and then later at Orléans, the rise of one of the great and legendary figures of the Middle Ages, Joan of Arc, real name Jeanne d'Arc in the French, but we'll call her Joan for clarity. Joan was born in 1412, while the English and French were actually still at peace at this time. We're told by the record that at age 13, Joan begins to have visions. Her first vision, while she was in her father's garden, was of the Archangel Michael and the saints Catherine and Margaret, who were two women from the time of the early church. And according to Joan, they told her to seek out the French and go to help the French army to defeat the English and push them out. So she goes to the nearest town, goes to the local garrison commander, and asks if he can take her to the French court. She's rebuffed with sarcasm, as you might imagine, but she comes back a second time, and she says in a prophecy, a prediction, that the French will lose to the England at Rouvray, where they were actually at the time trying to capture an English supply convoy. And this was significant because not only was she right in the prediction, the English do win decisively, but she made that prediction 3 days before scouts reported that it had happened. So now they start to obviously take this young girl very seriously. She is taken to the royal court at Chinon, where she asks King Charles for permission to travel with the army. At this point, the French are more than desperate, and they must, I can only assume, have seen Joan as perhaps the only source of hope in keeping up French morale in the fight. So she's given armor and a horse by the king, and she joins the army. And yet worrying, though, that she may be unorthodox, and that his enemies might say that he had allied with the devil to gain his throne, Charles has Joan vetted morally and theologically, and she is found to be, as the report goes, of irreproachable life, a good Christian, possessed of the virtues of humility, honesty, and simplicity. And yet Charles is still unconvinced by this, so he puts her to the test. He orders her to go to the city of Orleans, which at the time was under siege by the English, and break the siege, which was actually something she had predicted to Charles that she could do. So Joan arrives at Orleans in 1429, determined to win the city from the English. For the next 9 days, she does not fight. She picks up her own banner. She rides through the city and through the French positions and distributes food and water and carries her banner with her. She tells people that victory is soon at hand because God is with them, and the people of the city and the French troops begin to gain confidence, and they begin to fight harder. And although she never actually killed anyone and was actually herself wounded 3 times during those 9 days, the momentum that Joan spurs in the hearts of the French actually propels them to victory. She accomplishes in 9 days what the French hadn't accomplished in a year and a half in defeating the English. They rout the English, inflicting heavy losses, so Joan is now a national hero. She goes on to help lead several more French victories, and they inflict even heavier losses on the British. And then she is eventually captured by an ally of the English, the Burgundians, in 1430. She goes on trial, and she is brought before basically a bunch of English clerics that do not actually have the authority to try her in 15 sessions between mid-February and late March of 1431. The trial was basically a political entrapment. At one point, Joan is asked if she knew that she was in God's grace, and she answers, "If I am not, may God put me there, and if I am, may God so keep me. I should be the saddest creature in the world if I knew I was not in his grace." Which, the question itself was a trap, because at this time, the doctrine of the church was that no one could be certain of being in God's grace. If she had answered yes, then she would have been charged with heresy. If she had answered no, she would have confessed her own guilt. The court notary actually later wrote that at the moment the court heard her reply, those who were interrogating her were stupefied. But despite this, the transcripts that have her remarks were later altered against her. She would go on to be charged with cross-dressing because she traveled in men's armor and wore soldiers' clothing. And she was eventually sentenced to death and burned at the stake on May 30th of 1431. We are told by the record that she asked 2 of the clergy in the city where she was executed to hold a crucifix before her. And we're also told that an English soldier, in sympathy for her, constructed a small cross that she put in the front of her dress. After she dies, the English rake back the coals to expose her charred body so that no one could claim she has escaped alive. Sounds very the Jews and Jesus a little bit. They then burn the body twice more to reduce it to ashes, and then also to prevent any collection of relics, as people still did with saints, and then cast her remains into the Seine River. The executioner actually is on record as having stated, "He greatly feared to be damned, for he had burned a holy woman." Her time on earth was short, and her time serving France even shorter, but the impact Joan had is largely without question. She was seen as a martyr by the French from then on. She eventually goes on to be declared a saint. And she would galvanize the French in her life and in death, and they would go on to experience a resurgence of victories against the English. Now, on a brief side note, and I apologize to anyone watching who might disagree, which I don't think anyone would, but still, regardless of the modern reputation that Joan of Arc has gained, as her brothers and sisters in Christ, Christians have a better claim on Joan of Arc than any sort of feminism does. Joan was not a feminist hero who cast aspersions on the French patriarchy and championed the cause of women. And we know that because she didn't talk about those things. She never wrote about those things. She was never recorded as having talked about those things. That wasn't what she was about. What she talked about was God and her devotion to God and to Christ. And all she ever claimed was that she had been chosen by God to help lead her people to victory. By every available account, she was an incredibly pious and chaste young woman. A great example of this actually happens while she's imprisoned, awaiting her trial. She's unwilling to change into women's clothes to counter the cross-dressing charge, because doing so would have removed the protection of soldiers' clothes. When they were, at the time, the way that they came together basically prevented in any way removal by force of the clothes. And the removal of that protection would open her up, as you might expect in a prison with a woman, to molestation and possibly rape, which that was attempted on her. And she did not want this simply because she did not want to besmirch her virginity in the eyes of God. Go find a good history of her, which might be hard to do, but go find a good history of her, because she really was incredible. And she really did do incredible things for her people. She didn't do everything that the myths basically suggest, but she did do a great amount. But aside from what she did, she also, as I said, becomes a rallying point for the French in death. And so from that point forward, the French begin to steadily take the initiative, and the English rapidly begin to lose theirs. The French continued to inflict defeats and begin to slowly push the English out of the French lands. And the final nail in the coffin was the Battle of Castillo in July of 1453. The French decisively defeat the English, and even though the two would remain formally at war for the next 20 years until the Treaty of Picquigny in 1475, the English were effectively defeated. They renounced all claims to the French throne and all French land claims that they had made or taken. So what is the significance of this? It marks the end, the 100 Years' War does, of a long period stretching back to the Norman Conquest of French instability at the societal level and then at the political level. It also starts them towards the transformation, really, that you can chart through the history, from a feudal monarchy, like all of the other governments of the time, to a more centralized state. It indirectly leads to the Wars of the Roses, which were a over 30-year period of civil wars in England, which came about for several reasons, but one of them being the result of tensions over economic losses that English landowners in France had undergone. And though the English and French would go to war several more times between then and the modern day, it has had a huge hand in developing the modern states of England and France politically and economically. I think now's a good time to take a break. When we come back, we will talk about the Black Plague. If I have caught you early on break, I apologize. I did want to cut it off just a couple minutes early, simply because the next thing we have to talk about is honestly of more importance than the first thing we talked about, and I want to make sure I can get it all in a good time for you. As important as the 100 Years' War was to England and France, it pales in comparison to the effect that the Black Death had on the world as a whole. Peaking in Europe between 1347 and 1351, so about 10 years after the 100 Years' War started, it would continue to spread throughout Europe, and it had a death grip on basically the entire continent throughout the war and then beyond. The Bubonic Plague, as it was technically named, or is technically named, will continue to go on to pop up on and off throughout Europe and other places in the world for the next 5 centuries. You don't see the last cases in Europe of plague until the 1890s. And it's hard to quantify just how devastating the plague was. I mean, we can quantify it in numerical terms somewhat, but we can't get the full picture. As it spread during the first outbreak, just in that 4-year span from 1347 to 1351, half of the population of Europe died. Half. Some estimates say it was as much as 60% of the population of Europe. In some places in Europe, it was over 80% of the population. In the first year of the outbreak, between 1347 and 1348, before the physicians and more importantly the governments of Europe even had time to try to figure out how this is happening and where it came from, a third of Europe's population was already dead in the first year. The immediate and the long-term effects of the Black Death were hard-hitting and long-lasting. But where did it come from? The consensus today is from rodents in Asia. Rodents in Asia, particularly black rats, migrated through Central Asia, most likely alongside the advance of the Mongol hordes, actually, as they swept into Europe. However they did it, they carried with them the Oriental rat flea, as it's called, which was common to Asia at the time, still is today, and which commonly carried the bacterium Yersinia pestis, which is naturally occurring in rodents and other species, and is the cause of the bubonic plague. This is it at 200 times magnification. Regardless of how they arrive there, black rats, which I will not show because I am afraid of rodents and I do not want to see a picture of one, are considered to have been the primary means of transmission. And honestly, it was, if we look back on it and consider all the context at the time, it was really easy to see, and you can honestly kind of expect that an outbreak was going to happen. First of all, the plague was already ravaging Asia. By the time it starts in Europe and comes to Europe in 1347, the plague has already been ravaging Asia for years. Starting out in Mongolia or China, one of the two, it travels along the Silk Road, across India, and into the Near East. Many people in Europe, at all levels of society, knew a plague was probably coming because they could see the westward spread in real time. But secondly, all across the world at this time, but particularly in Europe for our purposes, there was no awareness of what's called germ theory. The best way to describe Europe at this time is one word: filthy. There was no awareness that microorganisms can transmit diseases as we know today. Cities were particularly disgusting. Everywhere was filthy, but cities were the worst. Human and animal waste ran freely in the streets. In most cities didn't have sewer systems like they do today. Animals of all sorts, domesticated or not, lived and walked around openly. People that were themselves dirty and grimy. The old trope of taking a bath once a month is accurate, and for common people, it was longer than that. All of it to say, the conditions were ripe for the spread of transmissible disease. Plague was reportedly first introduced to Europe via traders from Genoa, which is in Italy, sailing from the port city of Kaffa, which is in the Crimea, so Ukraine, in 1347. During a siege of the city in the previous 2 years, 1345 and 1346, The Golden Horde of the Mongols, which at the time was already suffering from the plague, catapults infected corpses over the city walls of Keffa to infect the inhabitants. And though I'm sure that worked to some degree, it's more likely that infected rats actually just went from the Mongol camp across the battle lines and into the city to infect people. As the disease took hold, these Genoese traders fled across the Black Sea to Constantinople. And that's where the disease first arrives in what's considered mainland Europe in summer of 1347. Carried by 12 Genoese galleys, plague arrived by ship in Sicily in October of 1347. From there, the disease spread rapidly all over the island. Galleys from Kaffa then reached Genoa and Venice, two major maritime republics of the time in January of 1348. But a few weeks later, with an outbreak that happens in the city of Pisa, of Leaning Tower of Pisa fame, this is where we have the entry point to northern Italy. Towards the end of January, one of the galleys was expelled from Italy, and they arrived at Marseille in southern France. From Marseille and then from Italy before then, the disease spreads northwest across Europe. It strikes France, Spain, Portugal, England by June of 1348, spreads east and north through Germany, Scotland, Scandinavia by the time of 1350. It was introduced into Norway in 1349, and then from there it spread into Iceland. Finally, it spread to northwestern Russia in 1351. In areas that had less developed trade with their neighbors, the plague was a little more uncommon, so you don't see as great of mortality rates. Some places like this would include the Basque community in northern Spain, isolated parts of Belgium and the Netherlands, and also just mountainous villages cut off from regular trade. Many Europeans at this time were already also suffering from malnutrition and compromised immune systems. You see a massive time of famine early in the 1300s, combined with the outbreak of war between England and France, had left tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, starving. You also have at this time what's called the Little Ice Age. It's not really an ice age; it's just what we call it again for the sake of clarity, which was a period of observably colder temperatures than the previous years all across Europe. Europe had, at this time when the Little Ice Age starts, been in actually a season of much warmer average temperatures for several decades. And so these yield, as you might imagine, greater crop yields, but they also have larger populations and higher birth rates. And so eventually we're running out of supply for the demand. And so as these famines start happening, we see at the same time the temperatures begin getting colder, and people begin to run out of food in most places. Governments begin to restrict certain types or amounts of food going to the populace. So what you have basically are, at the time the plague strikes, people who are eating less, eating poorer quality foods, and starting to get really cold as well. So all this to say, this chain of events really creates the perfect storm, as it were. And the plague hit Europe basically at the perfect time for it to spread in order to cause the most damage possible. So what did it look like exactly? Symptoms include high fever, headaches, painful aching joints, nausea and vomiting, general just feeling of illness or malaise. The most commonly noted symptom, which I'm sure we know of, was the appearance of what were known as buboes, which is a type of lymph node swelling in the groin, the neck, and the armpits, which oozed pus, and they bled when they were opened. The development of these was followed by acute fever, very high fever, and vomiting of blood. Most victims died 2 to 7 days after infection. Freckle-like spots and rashes, which could have also been caused by flea bites, were another potential sign of plague. Actually, if you've ever heard as a child singing or dancing to Ring Around the Rosies, that was a song created to help children understand the plague and understand the symptoms of the plague. So sorry to ruin that one for you, but that is where that comes from. But these are just the symptoms of one strain of the plague, the bubonic plague, which is named after those buboes, those lymph node swellings. There were 2 other kinds of the plague, which were worse than the bubonic plague. These were the pneumonic plague, which primarily affected the lungs, but it killed more quickly and it spread more easily due to coughing. And then the septicemic plague, which was blood poisoning, which was considered to be actually the most merciful of the types, because even though it rapidly attacked and killed your red and white blood cells, you were usually dead within a matter of hours. There are many first-hand accounts of the plague from the time, and I want to read one for you that I think best sums up the fear and the hysteria and the hopelessness of the time. This comes from an Italian writer. Father abandoned child, wife husband, one brother another. For this illness seemed to strike through the breath and sight, and so they died. And none could be found to bury the dead for money or friendship. Members of a household brought their dead to a ditch as best they could, without priest, without divine offices. Great pits were dug and piled deep with the multitudes of dead, and they died by the hundreds both day and night. And as soon as those ditches were filled, more were dug. And I buried my own beloved and my 5 children with my own hands. And there were also those who were so sparsely covered with earth that the dogs dragged them forth and devoured many bodies throughout the city. There was no one who wept for any death, because all awaited death. And so many died that all believed it was the end of the world. Remember, we're in a time when terrible things, seemingly cataclysmic things, happen. The most logical response, and really the only conceivable response for so many people across Europe, was to assume God was punishing the people. No one could have seen in entirety how much the Black Death would lay waste to cities, ruin economies, destroy kingdoms, and upturn what most people consider to be everyday, daily life. In fact, I have a couple of pictures from the time here that really sum up the attitude that people had towards the time. You can see here people are surrounding one of the riders of the apocalypse. A similar picture is here. Both are period pictures from the time. This sums up what people thought. This was the apocalypse. There was no other explanation. Everything was ending, and it had to be. And when all this did happen, there was no other explanation for basically all of Europe than to assume that all of the peoples of Europe in entirety had somehow committed a sin against the Lord that had then brought on his wrath. Also remember that the most significant period of outbreak, what we're referring to as the Black Death, from 1347 to 1351, comes at the outbreak of the 100 Years' War, as we've said. And so what do we know about that after this point? That Western Europe was basically engulfed in war, one place or another, for almost 120 years. So nations are trying to wage war while their citizens and even their armies are dying from the plague. France itself lost half of its population during the 100 Years' War, and much of that came from the initial outbreak. England only lost somewhere between 20 and 30% of its population, which is largely attributed to just the fact that it was an island, so it was harder for the spread to happen. As I said earlier, though, the cities are the hardest hit. Paris loses half of its 100,000 people during this time. London loses 60% of its 125,000 people. In Florence, which is in Italy, which would go on to later become the center of the Italian Renaissance, over 80% of its people died within the first 4 months of the outbreak and the plague reaching the city. Before 1350, there were roughly 170,000 settlements of various sizes across Germany. But by 1450, this number was reduced to 40,000. All told, stretching from Europe all the way into Asia where it began, somewhere around 500 million people died during the Black Plague. Europe's population didn't reach its pre-plague levels until almost the end of the 1500s. There's no accounting for this in our mind's eye. We hear the numbers, but 500 million people are dead in no more than a decade. There were, as we have today, there were not state-enforced quarantines. There were not mask orders, not that they would have helped. There weren't curfews like we have them. This was pandemic beyond an unstoppable scale. And the only reason it ever really went away is, if you can believe it, because it sprung up too many times. Because there were so many outbreaks, those who would survive would progressively, with each coming one, develop resistance to the different types of the plague. So mortality rates we can observe declining with each new outbreak until the plague sort of goes underground, for lack of a better way to put it. It wasn't eradicated globally until the 20th century. All that said, how did this affect ordinary people? And how did this affect the church? Well, you had mass graves everywhere. Everywhere. No time or no body to bury the dead. So bodies were simply thrown into deep trenches and buried. Many times they were burned first, and the ashes were what was buried. There are still several sites, in fact, throughout Europe, where if you examine under the top inch or so of topsoil, you will come across ash, which is the remnants of plague victims. Doctors at this time, or really anyone with any understanding of medicine, were completely at a loss for means or ways to treat people. You would often see doctors like this, plague doctors, as pop culture calls them, wearing masks like this bird-like mask, which actually had herbs, believed to be medicinal herbs, stuffed in the front of it that were actually thought to ward off the plague. This proved to not be true, but that was the thought. Bishops and priests had no answer. Some of them believed the plague could be avoided by seeking God's forgiveness, but by and large, the clergy across Europe were helpless to answer the hysteria of the people. Cities stood largely empty. Most large ones did. Large cities with the capacity to hold upwards of 120 to 150,000 people, the largest cities of the day, that had been reduced by half to 2/3, that number, had dozens, if not hundreds, of empty houses, shops, forges, and empty farms outside the city boundaries. The spread of the plague is so fast and so precipitous at this time that in most of Europe, you see national and local economies either totally collapsing or at least being strained to a point where they're basically paralyzed. Most goods are not being made. Much food is not being produced, either because there's a lack of crops or because anyone that happened to have a surplus couldn't find anyone to buy it, or because the animals that would have been butchered had already died from the plague. Inflation at this time is beyond sky high, universally so. On the societal level, those who managed to survive the Black Death are living in a new world. Many of the societal aspects that were common to life before the plague were, by the time it was over, either suspect or were done away with entirely. For example, serfdom is gone. The feudal concept of serfdom, the idea of people being bound to the lands of a feudal lord. With a rapidly declining population, the demand for labor skyrockets because there's fewer people available to do the work. And so those in the lower to middle classes have incredible bargaining power now with those that are in power because they don't have to put up with the old ways anymore. If the lords need the work, why should the peasants put up the higher taxes? Why should they put up with poor labor practices? So in many ways, in many places, there is societal mobility and working flexibility for the first time ever, if not in at least a long, long time. The wealthy and the nobility would try to fix this in their minds by imposing harsher conditions of serfdom and harsher taxes in their minds to try to maintain stability, but nearly all of these attempts failed. And many people in Europe were, for functionally the first time in their lives, or even in the history of their own lineage, free to do as they pleased in many ways. You also have the effects of the 100 Years' War, contributing to the ruin of the countries involved. And you also have what's known as the Avignon Papacy, which was a period of 67 years, almost 70 years, in which 7 successive French-born popes lived in France rather than in Rome. And this was a time that actually ended up causing a schism within the Western Church, the Papal Schism as it's known, during which time in this schism there are several instances of 2 popes ruling at the same time, one in Avignon, one in Rome, and one instance of 3 popes claiming the papacy at the same time. And even though, as bad as this was, the Papal Schism was eventually mended sometime later. And so what the controversies of the Avignon Papacy and the Papal Schism do are to create doubt in the minds of the people in the moral integrity of the church itself. So socially and religiously, the Black Death really sort of serves to open up Pandora's box, to put it one way. The ordinary people don't have to put up with the old ways anymore. And between political leaders in war and religious leaders during the papal crises, the leadership of the West is failing in its duties entirely. And there is much reason to doubt their efficacy in leadership. And so you see after the end of the Black Death, some of the most popular and significant, historically, peasant uprisings of the Middle Ages. Popular revolts by the peasantry in the attempt to either demand certain changes to the structures of society, or in some cases to try to overthrow the nobility entirely. The 2 most significant of these were the Guild Revolt in Florence in 1378 and the English Peasants' War, which is pictured here in 1381. Governments were at this time basically trying to up their taxation by 2 or 3-fold, especially in England and France, to pay for the 100 Years' War, but then also to compensate for the ravages of the plague. And so the peasantry, as you might imagine, got fed up with it, and they revolted. As far as the church is concerned, historians have always noted that after the 14th century, after the end of the plague, we begin to see that the religion espoused by the Catholic Church becomes, for lack of a better word, darker. It becomes more concerned with the issue of death. Some of the excesses of the Catholic Church that we associate with the Middle Ages only begin to happen during this time, during and after the Black Death. You see the rise, for example, of the flagellation movement, where penitent people who are seeking to, in their minds, ease God's anger expressed through the plague, begin going around in public procession, whipping themselves on the back, and essentially coming with a public display of almost super penance, for lack of a better way to put it, often to bloody excess, as you could probably expect. We also begin to see emerging this trend of an extensive concern for just the idea of penance in general. This desire we'll get the plague behind us if we just have everyone confessing sin all the time. We see during and after the plague a spike of persecutions by the church and by many Christians, particularly of the Jewish communities, but also of other smaller groups throughout Europe, even of lepers who just looked like they were plague victims. We also see that when the Catholic Church later begins to create and commission art in the later Middle Ages, a little after this time, you see a number of changes in the tone and the style of the artwork, such as the Danse Macabre, where you see someone confronted with skeletons dancing and mocking the premise of death in front of them. And also just an increased focus on the death and particularly the sufferings of Christ on the cross, but then also particularly being removed from the cross. You know, if you can picture it, lying there is Christ, dead and lifeless. And so for these people in this time, you can imagine how this would resonate because you've seen so many people in the same dead and lifeless state, including their own families and children. And so people began to identify the death of Christ with man's death, their death. And again, the church during this time is fractured. For many decades, It's spirited away from Rome to France. This is why Catholic historians today still refer to it as the Babylonian captivity of the church. It's co-opted by the French government, and then as it later breaks up into 3 different groups, it seems to the ordinary person as though the papacy, this once great anchor of the Western church, does not possess the moral authority to answer the crisis of the Black Death. So in the end, as has been established by now, the combination of the 100 Years' War and the Black Death utterly ravaged Europe. Europe would never be the same after this time. We will see from here European society progressively begin to become less religious and more secular, which we see first in the Renaissance and then later in the Enlightenment, and which continues to the present. We will see the Catholic Church further abuse its power and co-opt the minds of the people of Europe, adding more and more and ever more unbiblical and harmful doctrines and dogmas to the Catholic faith. The darkness seems to come upon Europe, metaphorically speaking. This period of the Middle Ages, at least to me more than any other, is most responsible, as far as I can imagine, for giving rise to the myth of these being the Dark Ages. And perhaps if you simply looked at the crises of the 14th and 15th centuries, that makes sense. There's not without good reason that you would think that. But it's also from this darkness, particularly within the church, that we will see the light of the gospel begin to, for the first time in centuries, and in some places maybe ever, flicker in the hearts of the people of Europe. These tumultuous times, these times of war and then times of plague, societally and religiously set the stage for the eventual rise of names like John Wycliffe, Jan Hus, and chief among them, Martin Luther. And so until next week, have a good night.